Welcome to your astrological forecast for the week of Monday, June 9th through Sunday, June 15th, 2025. This week, there's suddenly a huge, very new focus on Cancer because we just had Mercury enter Cancer on Sunday the 8th, and then now Jupiter is entering Cancer on Monday the 9th. And this is, of course, a pretty big deal. Jupiter only enters a new sign once every 12 to 13 months. So, pretty big deal, especially because we have Jupiter leaving its sign of detriment in Gemini and entering its sign of exaltation in Cancer. So that is really good news. Having a benefic like Jupiter, which Jupiter tends to make life much more easier. It tends to bring a lot of abundance. So having Jupiter exalted now in Cancer is generally really good news for us. Could show a lot of potential for growth, abundance, especially like economically as well. Could be a lot more growth. I think this is especially true because we just saw Venus do something very similar, where only last week Venus entered Taurus and left Aries. So Venus left its sign of detriment as well and entered its sign of domicile. So very similar, both the great benefics, Jupiter and Venus, leaving their signs of detriment, entering signs where they're much more powerful. And both can bring a lot of abundance and pleasure for sure. So that's definitely big news. This is also big news specifically for the Cancers out there. If anyone has Sun in Cancer, Moon in Cancer, any other especially potent placements in Cancer, I really think the luck is kind of turning for Cancers, if that makes sense. I think many people who have major Cancer placements have really struggled the last few years, last 2 to 3 years at least. I think there have been a lot of difficult transits for the Cancerians out there. So I'm actually personally really pleased to see this Jupiter entering Cancer, and a little bit later on this year there will be a time where Venus and Jupiter are both in Cancer together. So that is really exciting. If you or anyone has major Cancer placements, things could be turning around in a really powerful way. Also this week there is a full moon at 20 degrees Sagittarius, and so that is of course a big deal as well. What's interesting about this full moon is that it doesn't really aspect a whole lot, but it does occur very close to the time where the sun is squaring the nodes. So in other words, sun squares the nodes, and then pretty close to that same time there's a full moon as well. So basically sun and the moon opposing each other, and each of them are both squaring the nodes. Basically what that means is that this full moon is occurring as far away from eclipse season as possible. Eclipse season occurs like roughly every 6 months or so, twice a year. So this means that we just had eclipse season 3-ish months ago, like back in late February and March, and then we will have eclipse season coming up this fall as well. So basically what it means, to have the sun in between the nodes like this, to me it signifies a certain kind of checkpoint. I always say that it's not the kind of thing where there's going to be a major event whenever the sun squares the nodes. Like, you may not even really notice it, but it is significant in the sense that we're halfway between eclipse seasons. There is some kind of turning point, some kind of new chapter, some kind of transition there. So this is especially relevant because we just happen to have a full moon around the same time. There is some kind of culmination that's happening in conjunction with that, if that makes sense. And I always say that, a full moon, obviously, we all know a full moon is kind of a big deal. It's something that's very potent, very tangible, but especially a full moon in a fire sign like Sagittarius, that's really going to up, the sense of grandiosity, the drama, the eccentricity, and the action that would come with a normal full moon. That's only going to be multiplied with a full moon in a fire sign like Sagittarius. So we'll talk about that in this forecast as well. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before we get into the day-by-day forecast is pretty much as soon as Jupiter enters Cancer, once it reaches 1 degree Cancer, it squares Saturn. And then shortly after that, not this week, but the next week, Jupiter will square Neptune as well. And, I always like to mention outer sign aspects because they are pretty rare, and they do signify some kind of huge event or turning point, some kind of chapter, when it comes to, a more long-term perspective. So what are we going through as a society? What are we going through historically? Um, you know, outer planets such as, Jupiter squaring first Saturn and then Neptune. That's signifying something major that we're going through as a people, as a society. So I'll talk about that as well. But yeah, let's get into the forecast. By the way, I have been doing a lot more readings lately, which I'm definitely pleased to do. I have been really busy. I've been juggling a few things, but I always like to do readings. So if you are interested in getting a reading, I always leave my website and my email in the description of every video I post, so you can check that out if you're interested. But otherwise, let's look at Monday, June 9th. So for Monday, there is honestly kind of a laundry list of different things happening today. It's a pretty interesting way to start the week, really. We start out the day with Moon in Scorpio. Around noon Eastern Time, Moon leaves Scorpio and enters Sagittarius. And as I just mentioned, later on this week, we will have that full moon in Sagittarius. So I do think that's especially significant. Moon has already entered the sign where it will soon be full. Technically, that doesn't happen until Wednesday the 11th, so we are a couple days away. But still, having the moon in the sign where it's going to be full, it does indicate a certain kind of intensity, I would say. If you see the moon around this time, like probably at night, it's going to appear pretty full, maybe not exactly full yet. So with that comes already a sense of heightened action, intensity, drama. There's a lot of dynamic energy there. Things are starting to happen, right? And looking at the signs that the sun and the moon are in, with sun in Gemini, moon in Sagittarius, we're highlighting this kind of Gemini Sagittarius axis. This axis is all about learning. It's all about curiosity, exploration, and adventure. These are the mutable yang signs. So these signs, probably more than any other signs, are extremely open to experiencing, totally new ideas, new energies, new experiences. Of course, Gemini is a little bit more cerebral. Sagittarius can definitely be cerebral as well. But Sagittarius is more, because it's a fire sign, it's more physically oriented. Gemini, though, can also be interested in physical activities too. It's just more like mental in nature, right? But combining both of these, it's indicating that we may be at a place where we are universally restless. We're universally curious. We're branching out onto a new level, and we're interested in potentially exploring some pretty deep concepts, like deep ideas, or perhaps like physical experiences that bring up deep feelings, deep ideas, deep concepts, etc. Also today there are a few different aspects. Jupiter will enter Cancer today. That would be like technically later in the day Eastern time. Honestly, the exact time frame doesn't exactly matter. My view on ingressions like this is that unless you have placements right around like the first few degrees of Cancer in this case, you're not so much going to notice this ingression. Or perhaps too, like if your chart is very, very Jupiter ruled, or if you're very psychically linked to Jupiter in whatever way, for whatever reason, then yeah, you might notice, the exact moment that Jupiter enters Cancer. But for most of us, this is more of a long-term cycle. This is more signifying the end of you could say one kind of year sort of Jupiter in Gemini. Now we're entering basically a year of Jupiter in Cancer. So again, there's going to be a lot more abundance for most people, especially for those people that have major Cancer placements. But again, that's not something that you're going to notice like the exact hour that Jupiter enters Cancer. That's going to be something that you'll start to notice it in the days and weeks following this ingression. Other than that, there are a few aspects today. So first of all, Venus at 3 degrees Taurus squares Pluto at 3 degrees Aquarius. To me, that could signify some kind of clash between the abundance, so with Venus and Taurus, we have this new kind of clarity in regard to, what supports me? How do I support myself in a long-term fashion? How do I support my long-term health and pleasure and sustainability? So that in itself is relatively simple right now with Venus and Taurus. That's a very strong transit. It's a strong placement. But as this square happens between Venus and Pluto, there's some kind of clash between our immediate needs, what's good for us, versus some kind of power structure or some kind of something much more broad in nature. Pluto in Aquarius has more to do with like the darkness that comes from either technology or from groups, organizations, hierarchies, like technocracy or things like that. Social norms. It's much more broad, much more complex in nature, and much darker, right? So there's some kind of clash there. Overall, I see I see Venus as much more like dignified or much stronger. Because Venus is in her home sign, she's squaring Pluto, which I've said before. I regard Pluto as being in fall in Aquarius. So in other words, like they're making this clash. They're kind of disagreeing. It's sort of like an argument, right, between these two planetary energies. But because Pluto is so estranged and Pluto is a little bit um, weak right now, I guess you could say, or disadvantaged, Venus is much stronger. Also, part of that too is that Pluto is retrograde. Retrograde planets do have certain strengths that direct planets don't. That's definitely true. But overall, I would say, especially with these outer planets when they're retrograde, it's almost like they're kind of asleep, if that makes sense. Their energies still affect us, but they affect us in a more non-physical, kind of subtle way. Like they're almost more subdued, right? So that's another reason why I would say Venus is much stronger here. So putting it all together, I would say this aspect shows that there's some kind of clash between Venus and Taurus is showing very straightforward kind of logic. Like we intuitively know what's right for us. There's this clash between that knowing versus the collective. But in this case, the more straightforward, like firsthand, subjective needs and desires, I think will kind of prevail or like win here. I guess you could say. Mercury is also up to a couple of different things today. So Mercury has just entered Cancer, as I said in the intro, and let me talk about that in itself first to just provide a little bit more context. So I actually really don't hate Mercury transiting Cancer. Mercury was at home in Gemini, and Mercury in Cancer is not at home, but it's not debilitated either. It's kind of a neutral place. Mercury in Cancer, I think, is actually more powerful than most people would give it credit for because, yes, Cancer is this very emotional water sign, so that does appear like Mercury's out of place there. Mercury prefers the more detached, analytical signs. But Cancer is very focused on kind of like nuance, I would say. Cancer is a very intuitive sign. Cancer being the sign of emotion, Cancer is very focused on a lot of nuance in regard to like different flavors of emotion, like different, all the different spectrums of emotion. So I think that's where, Mercury actually has kind of a lot to sort of chew on as it transits through Cancer. There's so much intuitive ability, but also so much, I guess you could say, like information that's gleaned from emotion. Like a thought and emotion actually have a lot in common. They're kind of like opposite yet complementary, right? So I think the Moon and Mercury actually have a pretty decent time in each other's signs, if that makes sense. Last thing I'll say about that is that Cancer also has a certain kind of like intuitive pragmaticism that I think a lot of people maybe don't always notice or talk about. Cancer is known for these like extremes of emotion, and that's definitely, valid. That's an accurate side of Cancer as well. But Cancer also just has this very like been there, done that, very straightforward kind of pragmatic intuition or common sense. So I think that's another area where, Mercury can have that kind of practicality or the logic, I guess you could say. It is coming from a more intuitive or instinctual place in Cancer, but still Mercury can find certain things to chew on or to relate to as it goes through this sign. So anyway, so that's my take on Mercury in Cancer, just to provide you with a little bit of context. Mercury is the only water planet right now, which is a little funky. But it is kind of balancing out the chart. As we get into the following weeks and months, the chart is going to continue to be more and more like spread out and kind of diversified. We're in this long term process where earlier through much of spring, the planets were clustered in Pisces, but especially Aries. So it's like we just had some kind of really intense new beginning in spring. And then now we're sort of diversifying, depending on your astrology, your dominant signs and planets, we're each kind of branching out into our own individual experiences. And we really won't experience a lot of intensity, astrologically speaking, until like later this year. Anyway, so Mercury just entered Cancer. As it reaches 1 degree Cancer, it squares Saturn at 1 degree Aries. I always pay special attention to Cancer Aries squares because they are, I would say, particularly intense. Cancer is, of course, the water cardinal sign, and Aries is the fire cardinal sign. So both are intense in the sense that they are leaders. They are projecting, their own kind of authority or their own agenda, I guess you could say. But they're doing so in really dramatically different ways. Aries is, probably the most masculine sign, very fiery, very individualistic, very brash. Cancer is probably the most feminine sign, very yin oriented. It's not really brash at all. It's much more focused on stability and I don't know, more quiet, more yin energies, or more subtlety, more depth as well. So anyway, when you combine both of them, these are both potentially very emotional, very passionate energies, but in dramatically different ways. So having Mercury square Saturn like this, it just shows that we're becoming aware of our sort of limitations, I guess you could say, and really kind of clashing with them. We could also clash with authority figures right now. The things that might intuitively make sense to us, the things that we might be feeling and thinking, maybe in direct odds or at direct conflict with authority figures or other forms of like the structure of life. Also, when it comes to what else limits you, usually what limits us, it could be authority figures, but it could also be our resources, or the limitations of our resources, our time, energy, money. How do those things limit us? So again, that there could be a clash between our thoughts and feelings and our ideas versus like, okay, how much resources, how many resources do you actually have? So what is the answer here? This is another situation where I think, again, the inner planets are kind of prevailing with some of these aspects. Saturn is at fall in Aries. Mercury, like I said, is kind of in a neutral place in Cancer. So in this case, it's one of those situations where, you could almost picture like Mercury and Saturn fighting like in an arena or like boxing or something. But in this case, Mercury has the advantage. So it shows that, perhaps we can kind of outsmart the authority figures, or perhaps we can figure out through our intuition and our logic some kind of way to master our resources and, or maybe our lack of resources. Maybe we can still somehow utilize our resources in a way that honors our thoughts and feelings. Within the same day, Mercury first squares Saturn and then immediately squares Neptune. Saturn and Neptune are exactly 1 degree apart right now at 1 and 2 degrees of Aries. So it is pretty interesting seeing these planets aspects, both of them. So Mercury, again, first squaring Saturn and then in the same day squaring Neptune. So Saturn and Neptune, they're not exactly conjunct, but they're pretty close, 1 degree apart. So they're showing that as a collective or as a society, we're entering this new phase where we're very motivated, we're very ambitious. There's a lot of new ideas, new concepts playing out. There's a lot of new activity in general. We've left this like really foggy, kind of like hopeless period that we experienced for the last 2 to 3 years with Neptune and Saturn in Pisces. So now there's this new brash. It's like a new world, a brave new world, right? So having Mercury square both of these, it does show this new kind of awareness or focus on these new developments, or like in other words, like there's this new long-term event or chapter, and with Mercury being much more short-term in nature, making an aspect to these outer planets, it's showing that the two are connecting, I guess you could say. So in other words, like in our short-term reality, we're becoming aware of how how much things have changed in a more long term way, if that makes sense. But it is clashing. It's not. Our short term needs and viewpoints are at odds with the long term events that have been transpiring. Um, Also, with Mercury squaring Neptune, there's a clash between, like, again, what makes sense to us in the moment versus like the way that things have been changing with our values and the beliefs of the masses and the collective consciousness, right? There could be also a clash between the individual versus the collective. So anyway, this may, on a more general level, this may just make you feel a little bit wary or a little bit restless, especially if you have placements around, let's just say between 0 and 4 degrees of the cardinal signs. So Cancer, Aries, especially Cancer and Aries, but also Libra and Capricorn. You may feel restless, or there may be a need to make some kind of change in your life, and yet something is kind of like pressing on you or weighing you down. That's the energy of Saturn. Neptune is kind of making things confusing, but Mercury is trying to quantify everything and make sense of things. So strangely, there may be a lot of clarity that comes to us through our emotions at this time, or through our immediate feelings. Like, immediate feelings, it's kind of strange. That's not usually where you'd look to make sense of things. But in this case, that may actually be where the most straightforward logic is. Going to Tuesday, June 10th, so this could be a little bit simpler. So again, Moon is transiting through Sagittarius. Things are ramping up in intensity. We're getting closer and closer to that full moon. And today we do have one aspect as well. So that would be Mars at 26 Leo, trining Chiron at 26 Aries. So this is a pretty interesting one. I almost feel like Mars is kind of enabling Chiron in this aspect. Chiron and Aries is supporting us and being very intensely passionate about our own wounds, our own traumas, our own histories and backstories. It's definitely a transit that I associate with protests. So having Mars at 26 Leo, which is also, very boisterous, very proud. It's very strong, kind of, definitely a fighting energy, and it has a lot of endurance to it. Having Mars trine Chiron like this, I think it's showing, especially for some of us, if we, like, let's say if you have a lot of fire placements, if you do, any fire placement you have is probably being aspected by one or more placements right now. There's probably some kind of conjunction or trine going on. What I mean by that is, like, we have so many placements on, specifically today, Tuesday the 10th. There's just so many placements at very different degrees of the fire signs. So Neptune and Saturn are at the beginning of Aries at 1 and 2 degrees. Then we've got, the moon kind of transiting through the middle degrees of Sagittarius. And then Chiron and Mars are kind of in the middle of the last degrees of their respective fire signs in Aries and Leo, if that makes sense. So that's why I say, like, if you have placements pretty much anywhere in any fire sign, they're going to be experiencing either a conjunction or a trine, or maybe multiple conjunctions or trines on Tuesday. So again, like, look to any kind of fire placements that you have, and you can look to the specifics of which fire placements, like which placements do you have in fire signs, and then which planets are conjoining or trining those, because that could signify some kind of really bold intensity. Fire signs are kind of bold and intense anyway, and then conjunctions and trines are bold and intense as well. So there could be a lot of confidence when it comes to those placements you have in fire signs, like even more than usual. It could be a lot of intensity as well. Moon is, of course, like the planet of emotion. Mars is emotional as well. Mars is very passionate. It's all about fighting. Chiron is very sensitive and, passionate and emotional as well, especially in Aries. So there's just so much intensity right now in the fire signs, I think. So Mars trining Chiron is really bringing that out. And again, it's really emboldening, like, anyone who feels like they have to fight for their truth or their history, their story. That may, to me, this is a very double-sided energy. Chiron is in Aries, which is ruled by Mars, and then Mars is very strong, being in a fire sign. So I always say, like, with Mars Mars is technically a malefic. It's kind of a troublemaker energy, but I really view Mars as kind of double-sided. Depending on the situation, this could be really necessary. It could be really great to say, hey, I'm done feeling like I can't speak my truth. I'm just gonna put it out there. This really needs to be said. That could be just the right energy that's needed. But on the other hand, there could be too much confidence. It could be too impulsive or destructive even. We could be really brash and maybe we're not listening. So sometimes I think being so passionate about your own trauma or your own wounds, you might kind of lash out, which can be a good release, but it could also cause more pain, more trauma, more misunderstanding as well. So again, it's kind of I view it as kind of nuanced. This energy in itself is not nuanced. It's very intense, and I think we may feel like things are more simplistic than they actually are on Tuesday, if that makes sense. And that's what's kind of enabling us. That's what's making us feel so confident and so impulsive. But that in itself, the reason why I say it's nuanced is because that energy in itself might be very productive. It could also be destructive as well. Going to Wednesday, the 11th, this is the day where we have the full moon. It occurs very early Eastern time. So yeah, so just depending on where you are. If you're listening to this, you're probably in North America or maybe Europe. So the full moon should happen like sometime today. Depending on your time zone, it could happen late on Tuesday. But either way, so this is a very grandiose energy, right? For one, because the full moon is always kind of grandiose. There's always a lot of action and drama, generally with the full moon, but especially in Sagittarius. What more dramatic sign is there than Sagittarius? Sagittarius kind of expands everything, right? It's ruled by Jupiter, and I do find it interesting that this full moon. It's ruled by Jupiter, and then Jupiter has just entered Cancer, where it's exalted. So suddenly we have just so much Jupiter energy. Cancer, which is Jupiter's exaltation sign, and then plus the full moon in Sagittarius. So much energy that's just really grandiose. It's just kind of blowing things up. There's so much potential abundance right now. This full moon is like really loosely trining the Mars. Mars and Chiron, which just trined one day before. That trine is about 6 degrees away from making a grand trine with the full moon at 20 degrees Sagittarius. So again, factoring in these kind of loose fire trines, it's adding even more, really, really fiery energies, passionate. I think fire signs have a lot in common with Jupiter because they do kind of blow things up. They are dramatic. They can bring abundance, but they can also bring overindulgence or maybe too much of a good thing. I always say with full moons, or really with any moon aspect, I don't look at just the moon. I always look at the relationship between the sun and the moon, because I think that's kind of essential. So in this case, with sun at 20 degrees Gemini, moon at 20 degrees Sagittarius. Again, kind of like I covered this a little bit in the intro, but the sun and the moon, both the luminaries are in the mutable yang signs. So they're both encouraging growth and expansion. Branch out, try something new. Let's explore intellectually and with ideas and concepts, but let's explore in a very literal physical sense as well. You can of course look to what house does 20 degrees Sagittarius fall on in your chart, but also more specifically, like, what is the axis? 20 degrees Gemini, 20 degrees Sagittarius, what axis does that kind of play on in your chart? And that could show an area of a new kind of culmination, new activity, new ideas, new growth and expansion. But there could also be a sort of like a disconnect, or like these two polar opposite sides are kind of battling it out, if that makes sense. So sun is saying, sun is supporting Gemini, moon is supporting Sagittarius. Both the luminaries are going to be in opposite parts of your chart right now. So for instance, like it would be like, let's say you have your first house in Gemini, so sun is shedding all this light on your individuality and your personality, your energy. It's very individualistic for you, and yet the full moon would be in your seventh house right now, so it's shining light on what about other people? What about your partnerships, your relationships, your one-on-one interactions? So they are highlighting these opposing yet complementary parts of your life. A similar dynamic would be if the sun is at the top of your chart in the 10th house, it's being opposed by moon in the 4th house. That would be highlighting issues of like work-life balance, your work or public life versus your home life, etc. Um, but for all of us, we're experiencing some kind of dichotomy with our lives right now. What else could I say about this? I don't know. I think this is. I mean, I think I kind of summed it up already. It's very dramatic, but there is a lot of energy of abundance right now. Abundance in a much more straightforward way than I think we've experienced in a long time. I think for at least the last several months, we've really had to look outside of the box for our pleasures and for our areas of abundance. And now things may be a little bit more straightforward and much more in your face. This is not a subtle energy. It's very dramatic. There can be some kind of like scattered or like nuanced energies with Gemini and Sagittarius. There could be just like so many different things happening right now that we can get lost in the variety of all of it. But at the same time, this is straightforward in the sense that it is intense. It's very passionate. Like we know how we feel right now, if that makes sense. Strangely, we just had so much air energy. We just had a huge Gemini stellium, but right now we actually don't have a whole lot of air placements. Pluto's in Aquarius, Sun is in Gemini, and that's it. There's no other air planets at all. So really, I don't think this is a time where we're feeling, kind of intellectually like ambiguous. I think there continues to be a huge fire focus, as there has been for basically this entire year so far. And then now there's kind of a new water focus with Mercury and Jupiter in Cancer, especially because, like I said, Jupiter rules this full moon. So really with that, bit of fire, and especially with all that, or excuse me, with that bit of water and especially all the fire, yeah, I think we can at least have clarity right now. We can at least know what motivates us. We can feel passionate about something right now. Let's look at Thursday, June 12th. So no aspects today, but we do have Moon in Capricorn basically all day. So the reason for that is that at least for the Eastern time zone, which is what I base these forecasts off of, Moon leaves Sagittarius and enters Capricorn really close to midnight. So I always think it's interesting where we've got the full moon on Wednesday, and then only one day later, moon is already moved on. It's already in a completely different sign. Moon in Capricorn is very different. I think the transition from Sagittarius to Capricorn is one of, if not the most dramatic transitions between any two signs. Like any two signs that are next to each other are of course going to be dramatically different, but that's even perhaps more true for Sagittarius and Capricorn. So in other words, like this is going to be it's going to be a really dramatic high. It's going to be a high that like builds and builds, especially Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. This high is like building. There's more and more energy. It's ramping up, ramping up, ramping up. And then pretty soon after that peak on Wednesday, there's a dramatic like decline in the energy. Suddenly the moon is losing light. Moon is in detriment in Capricorn. So it's a completely dramatic change. It's a total different vibe, if that makes sense. So suddenly with Moon in Capricorn, we feel perhaps much more humble or stoic. We're focusing on the long term, like the change. It's a really dramatic change. So I'm almost wondering like what happened on Wednesday to bring about this change. Of course, it's going to be different for everyone, but we may experience some kind of extreme. We may be impulsive or reckless, or maybe someone in our lives is impulsive or reckless, or maybe there's some kind of change that kind of seems to come from out of nowhere. Like again, there's gonna be a wide range there. It's gonna be very different for each person, but some kind of shit like hits the fan, so to speak, on Wednesday, and then this leads to a complete change going to Thursday. Suddenly we feel a certain sense of, I don't know. I think Capricorn is just it's well, it's the sign that's the most focused on, I think, the future, I guess you could say, and I think that's another big difference for Sagittarius. Sagittarius is I don't know. It's more of a sign of just kind of, nothing matters. Like, just go for it. Like, just, eat, drink, and be merry. Don't worry about anything. I think Sagittarius is the most optimistic sign. It's, even dangerously optimistic. So going to Capricorn, that could not be more different. With Moon on Capricorn now, Capricorn's one of the least optimistic signs. We're suddenly fixated on planning for everything and maybe even being too strict with ourselves. It's also interesting that as the moon enters Capricorn, it opposes first Jupiter in Cancer, and then even by noon Eastern time, Moon is opposing Mercury. So now suddenly there's more of this opposition between Cancer and Capricorn rather than Gemini and Sagittarius. Um, so with this new focus on Cancer and Capricorn are very focused on like building some kind of structure, building some kind of foundation. They're really interested in deep long term security. And again, like that foundation is like a huge keyword for both Cancer and Capricorn. Um, so again, it's a really dramatic transition. Depending on your chart, if you're more yang or more yin oriented, or what elements are strong in your chart, you're probably going to be either like much more comfortable with the first half of the week and less comfortable for the latter half, or vice versa. These charts are really dramatically different. So yeah, it could be kind of a rude awakening or a wake up call. Um, but yeah, this is a very stoic, very sobering energy. It's kind of like I don't know. It's kind of like we had almost like a party of sorts Monday, Tuesday, and especially Wednesday. And then Thursday is kind of like the cleanup. Thursday is where we sober up and we focus on, okay, now what? Like, I need to go back to work. I need to clean up the mess. It's definitely not as fun of an energy, but much more productive for sure. Going to Friday, June 13th. This is technically the day where the sun squares the nodes. So again, not it's not an intense aspect in terms of like you're not going to feel this in a really dramatic way like you would a full moon or even a quarter moon. But sun squaring the nodes, it's like a checkpoint. It's just showing something is changing. We're reaching a turning point of sorts, so I always like to call that out. Otherwise, moon continues through Capricorn, so again we're still kind of like almost in the aftermath of this really dramatic first half of the week. We're kind of picking up the pieces, cleaning things up, thinking about, okay, where am I at? Like, what do I really want for the future? This may be very unusual for what we would typically experience at this time of year. It's kind of unusual that Sun is really all alone in Gemini, and again, Sun being one of only two air planets right now. Um, it's unusual for the sun to be alone. Usually the sun has Mercury in the same sign, and usually there might be like maybe one or two other planets in the same sign. Very unusual the sun is so alone right now. So in other words, we're still in Gemini season, but really that's not what the chart is about at all. Really, my focus again goes more to the Cancer Capricorn axis, and this is just it's such a new development since Mercury, Jupiter, and the moon. Like none of these planets were in these signs just a few days ago, or just several days ago. Um, so anyway, so in other words, like we just went from this transition from like super outgoing and like let's adventure and let's branch out to suddenly like the energy really contracts and we're getting much more serious and focusing on like inner circle, if that makes sense. Like let's pull back in, let's put the walls up. Let's I'm picturing like a turtle or a crab, like some kind of shelled creature, like pulling all its kind of limbs in and kind of, what's the word, cringing, sort of like pulling back. It looks like that's kind of what we're doing on a collective level, and becoming much more strategic or much more focused on our short and long term survival. I think, Cancer and Capricorn are very defensive signs, they're very walled signs, if that makes sense. So, okay, let's go forward to Saturday. So, as we start the weekend, Moon does leave Capricorn and enters Aquarius. Pretty much as soon as it does so, it conjoins Pluto. So that brings kind of very heavy and stoic energies again. Um, to me, it looks like a strange weekend. Um, Suddenly there is a little bit more of an air focus. Although we don't have a lot of air planets, having both the luminaries, both the sun and the moon, in air signs is enough to show a strong air focus. So that would indicate, again, we're a little bit more detached now. Aquarius, well, really all the air signs are dualistic in nature. I think I came up with that on my own. I don't think I've heard that anywhere else. But so anyway, what I mean by that is the air signs, like on the one hand, we could be playful, innovative, experimental, curious. We might be kind of branching out, trying new things, open to weirdness or even searching for weirdness. Like, what is unique? What's different? But on the other hand, with this kind of air focus, especially Aquarius, and with Pluto crossing over, or excuse me, Moon crossing over Pluto, um, there could be the opposite energy as well. So very strict, very stoic, very detached, and kind of just observant and empty in a way. Air can be both. Air can be windy and it can change things and move things around and be very powerful. And air can also be stagnant and just empty, right? So we can experience like the extremes of that kind of range with the sudden air focus. With Moon crossing over Pluto, we may feel particularly like kind of disconcerted. We may be more aware of our downfalls, of our limitations and weaknesses, or our insecurities. Fortunately, this is a really brief transit, so it really would mostly just affect, part of early or mid Saturday, and then it'll kind of dissipate as we get into later Saturday. And then finally, going into Sunday, June 15th, Moon continues through Aquarius, but again, fortunately, it's far enough away from Pluto that it's really, that aspect will really just affect part of Saturday, like I mentioned. Um, but again, both luminaries are in air signs, so being kind of detached, but also playful, intellectual for sure. There are two aspects today, and they're both squares. So as you probably know, squares are contentious. Squares bring about the energy of Mars, so they are kind of like they're the energy of conflict or combat. So Mars, as it goes through 28 degrees Leo, it squares Uranus at 28 degrees Taurus. So I find this to be especially interesting because I would say Mars and Uranus are the most volatile planets, and having them square, I would say the square aspect is the most volatile aspect. So having the two most volatile planets making the most volatile aspect between each other, that would clearly indicate the potential for some extreme volatility. Um, Especially with Mars and Leo is showing our pride and our ego and our our fiery energy, um, that is clashing with perhaps like recent changes to our finances or our how we support ourselves or our investments, our values. There could be some, we could be experiencing some kind of wake up call or some kind of awakening with what we value and how we support ourselves in the long run. There's also an aspect today that is perhaps even more noteworthy. Jupiter at 1 degree Cancer is squaring Saturn at 1 degree Aries. Um, so this is pretty interesting. I mean, for one, both of these are outer planets. So outer planet aspects, like I mentioned, are very rare and indicate that we are experiencing some kind of really big change on a long-term kind of historical or societal level. But this aspect in particular is also interesting because Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Saturn is at fall in Aries. So in other words, Jupiter is about as strong as it gets. Saturn is about as weak as it gets. So there's a clear um, inequality of like the power here. Jupiter is easily the the stronger energy here. Um, so this could show, on the one hand, on a societal level, we're very like we may have been, well, we clearly have been experimenting with like unusual governmental policies or very unusual kind of societal attitudes. Like we're really, I mean, Saturn in Aries is definitely kind of a rebel placement. We may be very hard on ourselves, but we may also be very prone to experimenting or trying something different, doing something that we're like not supposed to, if that makes sense, or that wouldn't be traditional. So we're combining that energy with Jupiter in Cancer, which is, the peak, like kind of boisterous, expansive energy. It's much more straightforward. It's very intuitive, if that makes sense. Like, it's just kind of expanding what we know to be true, what we feel in our hearts, so to speak. So there's some kind of clash there. But combining both of these together, it shows a lot of change. Squares always bring about change. They bring about newness. They're conducive to dramatic change. So um, I think that's pretty much all I can say about that. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some kind of really intense new developments, um, especially coming from government or just in general as well. This week, on a more general level, there could be those protests, especially coming about like Tuesday or Wednesday with that Mars Chiron trine, and then the full moon happening right after. So Sunday could be kind of a reaction to that as well, like these really dramatic events happening Tuesday, Wednesday, and then those kind of lead to more like a more dramatic reaction happening on Sunday, if that makes sense. But yeah, but that's pretty much what I have for you for this week. So I hope you have a great week. It does look like a strange one, and next week we have kind of more strangeness coming. We will have the summer solstice coming about, and Sun entering Cancer, and Mars will change signs as well. We've also got more outer planet aspects happening, and then the third quarter moon to shake things up as well. So, but yeah, I really hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week.